1, 2, 3. They were making pants, t-shirts, trousers, shorts for brands such as Mango, Walmart or Primark. We are in Dhaka, the capital city of Bangladesh, April 24, 2013. On that day, garment workers didn't know what to expect when they arrived at their workplace, the Rana Plaza. The day before, the owners of the building had been informed of cracks in the structure by the workers themselves, but they ignored the warnings and forced them to get back to work, or they wouldn't be paid. The building collapsed, leaving more than 1,000 deaths and around 2,400 injured workers, the deadliest accident in the garment industry. The story is still relevant today because it concerns the brands that we wear every day all over Europe. The companies, the owners of the brands, somehow allowed this to happen because they didn't check on the working conditions of their subcontractors. And it wasn't the first time. According to the European Commission, today 160 million children worldwide are in child labor. That is 1 in 10 children in the world. Nearly half of these children are performing dangerous work. At the same time, 25 million people worldwide are in a situation of forced labor. The EU, led by the S&D Group, wants to improve the situation now, proposing a ban on forced labor as well as a law to foster sustainable and responsible corporate behavior throughout the entire supply chain of companies. So how can we make sure that the clothes we wear are made responsibly? Or that the coffee we drink has been collected under fair conditions? Or that the phone we use doesn't contain any materials extracted through forced labor? In one word, how can we make sure that companies do their due diligence? Let's find out in this new episode of What's Left. Take a t-shirt. Have you ever asked yourself the question, how is it made? There are different steps to manufacture a t-shirt. It starts from creating its design and sample cutting to mass production sewing and cutting. Along the process, big garment companies very often outsource the production abroad, mostly in Asia. The process from the creation of the product to selling it in shops is called the supply chain. So how do we make sure that social and environmental standards, as well as basic human rights, are being respected along the entire supply chain of companies? This is exactly what due diligence is all about. Making sure that companies act responsibly and giving access to justice to anyone who has been a victim of a company's wrongdoings. Today, EU companies are only encouraged to behave responsibly, but no legal obligations are imposed on them. And this is exactly why the S&D Group in the European Parliament started this battle. To know more about it, we met the S&D MEP Lara Wolters, who is in charge of this file for the European Parliament.
Due diligence is a duty of care, essentially, and it's a duty of care for companies, and it's about environment, human rights and governance. So ultimately what this is about is companies investigating what's going on in their value chains and no longer saying we didn't know about deforestation, forced labor and those kinds of things. We don't have a law at the moment. Everything that's there at the moment is voluntary. What we need companies to do is really take responsibility and proactively go look at the problems that are most real to them in their value chains. So what we need to do is really make sure that there's accountability, responsibility that lies with the company and not make this into some tick box exercise that somebody somewhere in compliance is responsible for. What I want is for CEOs of companies' boardrooms to take responsibility, to know what's going on, and to personally get involved in this process. So we need to make sure that there's access to justice. We need to make sure that it's possible for local communities and so forth to take big companies to court. We need to make sure that they're facilitated in doing that if needed. And we need to make sure that there's remedy at the end of this. Ideally, of course, this law will prevent any problems. But if problems cannot be prevented, then we need to make sure there's access to justice, and we need to make sure that there's remedy that's satisfying. We had a huge amount of negotiating to do to get to this point. There was a huge amount of talking about this almost education, I would say, on what are the problems, what's already being done, and so forth, for us to be able to get to the consensus that we reached. That really wasn't easy. My role in that was mediating, facilitating, and pushing. And so as the draftsperson, I was of course very proud that we were able to get a big majority on this, and my role going forward will be to really get this law across the line.
After the European Parliament repeatedly called for a law on due diligence fought for by the progressives, the European Commission eventually came up with proposals. But the progressives weren't alone in this fight.
NGOs and civil society have been vital in raising awareness, in bringing examples of wrongdoing to our attention, and that's helped hugely with political momentum. I think they need to be involved in the process of making this legislation to make sure that we can actually have an impact on the ground.
We had the opportunity to discuss with one of the co-founders of these NGOs, Patrick Ali. Global Witness is a pioneer NGO defending human rights and natural resources through its investigative work and campaigning. The NGO started raising awareness about the crimes of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia and put a spotlight on the illegal conflict diamonds that financed bloody wars in Western Africa in the 90s.
Well, I think the broad proposal of a law on due diligence is a global game changer. Having worked in many parts of the world where companies have traded in timber or diamonds, whatever, that fund conflict or that result in tremendous environmental damage or human rights abuses, and there's no kind of catch-all thing to get them. If they have to abide by this law, then I think that's incredibly powerful. Companies hate regulation, and which is precisely the reason you probably should have it. It's a fundamental point that if you start a massive project, whether that's agribusiness or a mine or a hydroelectric dam, in somewhere where you're not wanted, the people are going to protest. Usually they're the ones that suffer for that. We document annual killings of land and environmental defenders. In 2020, it was 227 people, 4 people a week at least, murdered for protesting against projects. There are other areas of improvement which are essential, one of which is right now, as the draft goes, companies can devolve responsibility down the chain. And so if a supplier of the big company says, okay, the big company says, okay, we want you to guarantee that there's no forced labor in the supply chain, and that company says, yeah, okay, we'll guarantee it. That doesn't actually guarantee there's no forced labor in the supply chain. It guarantees that the big company isn't going to get penalized for it because they're going to blame the one down the line. So that needs to change. So we just produced this report which shows that, in fact, lots of the minerals are coming from mines where there are militias, where there is child labor. Some mines which are completely unproductive are being recorded as providing vast amounts of minerals. And even officials of ITSCI have been directly involved and taking a cut, we believe, from some of those deals, which is just a really good example of something which is high profile, internationally accepted, actually isn't working. And another thing which is missing really in the law right now is the role of finance. We've produced a lot of reports recently, for example, on the beef industry and the financing of the beef industry in Brazil. The beef industry in Brazil is responsible for 60% of the deforestation in that country. The money from one of the world's biggest producers, JBS, the money's coming from Western banks. That's who's financing them. So we have to have the banks and the financiers included in this, because without the money, these developments can't happen. And if the money continues, then they will continue to happen.
Si vous fabriquez des chaussures en Chine, vous les faites fabriquer par un fournisseur chinois. Ce fournisseur chinois est celui qui est responsable. Mais vous, Nike et Adidas, vous n'êtes responsable de rien. Et donc, même si votre fournisseur chinois emploie des esclaves, ou fait travailler des enfants, ou viole les droits sociaux, ou détruit l'environnement, eh bien, Nike et Adidas, qui pourtant gagnent de l'argent grâce à ce producteur chinois, ne sont pas responsables juridiquement.
The French MEP and philosopher Raphael Glucksmann has for years been drawing the world's attention to the Chinese regime's crimes against the Uyghurs, a Muslim ethnic minority from the northwestern region of Xinjiang. China, the largest supplier of goods in the world, is believed to detain more than 1 million Uyghurs in detention camps and to force them into work. Some big fashion firms are believed to have benefited from this modern form of slavery. We asked Raphael Glucksmann if this European law on due diligence could help the situations of Uyghurs in China.
Il y a des dizaines de marques, mais qui structurent votre quotidien, qui sont présents dans votre armoire ou dans votre mobilier, qui emploient et qui exploitent des esclaves via leurs fournisseurs chinois, des esclaves ouïghours. Une législation sur le devoir de vigilance aura un impact pour les Ouïghours, c'est évident. Parce qu'aujourd'hui, tout repose sur la mobilisation des consommateurs. Il y a eu des campagnes, on a organisé de grandes campagnes, par exemple pour interpeller Adidas ou H&M, qui ont changé leur chaîne de production et qui ont essayé d'éliminer l'esclavage en Chine de leur chaîne de production. Mais on a vu, par exemple, que le Parti communiste chinois a organisé des contre-campagnes de boycott contre H&M à cause de leur prise de position courageuse. Et donc, en fait, tant que ce n'est pas obligatoire, on rend nos entreprises extrêmement fragiles face au système chinois. Et les entreprises qui feront le bon choix en réponse aux demandes des consommateurs seront pénalisées en Chine. Alors que si on rend la chose obligatoire, c'est-à-dire que chaque entreprise travaillant en Chine devra procéder à ce devoir de vigilance et devra faire en sorte qu'il n'y ait plus d'esclaves sur sa chaîne de production, eh bien, ça laissera le gouvernement chinois complètement incapable de frapper telle ou telle entreprise. Et ça ne peut se faire de manière efficace qu'à l'échelle européenne, parce que c'est un marché tellement énorme. C'est le premier marché du monde. Et donc, aucune multinationale, aucun pays producteur, aucun fournisseur ne peut se passer du marché européen. Et donc, tout le monde devra obéir aux normes que nous allons édicter.
So, will the long-awaited rule book on sustainable due diligence for companies be a game changer? The Socialists and Democrats in the European Parliament are driving this legislation and fighting so that no company can make profits selling in the EU market by abusing workers or by polluting our planet. This is not business as usual.